It was the kind of day that felt like it belonged in a dream, soft golden light spilling through the windows, casting long shadows over the perfectly manicured lawns of Charleston's historic district. I was sitting at my small desk in my cramped apartment, clicking away on the keyboard, trying to finish my coursework in early childhood education. But my mind wandered, as it often did, back to the job postings I had been checking for the past few weeks. My rent was coming up, and while I loved my apartment, small, a bit run down, but mine, it felt like it was time for a change. Something bigger. Something that would allow me to invest in my future. So when Caleb Whitman's message flashed across my phone screen, I paused my work, my fingers hovering over the keys. I'm looking for someone to care for my 6-year-old son. The job requires occasional overnights, and the pay is $65 an hour. Let me know if you're interested. Caleb Whitman. My first thought was one of disbelief. $65 an hour? That was a fortune, at least compared to the rates I usually worked for. But more than that, it was a chance to step into a new world, a life I could only imagine, a life of financial security, of stability. The message was so straightforward it could have been a scam, but something about it felt real. After a quick Google search, I found that Caleb Whitman was the owner of an exclusive art gallery in downtown Charleston, a man with a reputation for both success and solitude. He was known for his taste, his meticulous attention to detail, and his no-nonsense approach to business. Not the type of person you'd expect to reach out to someone like me. The interview, though brief, was straightforward. Caleb didn't waste time with pleasantries. We discussed the job, care for his son, Evan, while Caleb traveled for work, possibly overnight stays, an occasional weekend gig. I agreed to meet Evan that Saturday. And so, on the day of the interview, I found myself standing in front of the Whitman estate, a beautiful mansion just off the water. The home was grand but not ostentatious, its warm brick exterior framed by ivy and creeping vines. The air smelled faintly of salt water and roses, and the soft murmur of the river could be heard in the distance. When the door opened, I expected to be greeted by someone older, someone more formal. But instead, there stood Caleb, a man in his late 30s, casually dressed in a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a pair of dark jeans, and black shoes that gleamed under the low sunlight. His brown eyes were sharp, but not unkind. They measured me, studied me in a way that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't used to. "You must be Noah," he said, his voice low but confident. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, trying to hide the nervousness in my voice. I extended my hand, and his grip was firm but not overpowering. There was something restrained about him, something beneath the surface that intrigued me. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "Come on in." Inside, the house was as elegant as the exterior suggested, with high ceilings, a mix of antique furniture and modern art, and large windows that overlooked the water. Caleb led me into a large living room, where a young boy, around 6, was sitting cross-legged on the floor, absorbed in a puzzle. His dark hair was a tangle of curls, and his eyes, the same shade as Caleb's, glimmered with curiosity. "Evan, this is Noah," Caleb said. The boy looked up, his expression cautious but friendly. "Hi," Evan said, his voice high-pitched but firm. I smiled, crouching down to his level. "Hey there, what are you working on?" Evan's face lit up as he proudly pointed to the puzzle pieces scattered on the floor. "I'm building a dragon." I was taken aback by how quickly he warmed up to me. Over the next few hours, I followed him around as he showed me his room, his toys, and his prized collection of action figures. Caleb observed us quietly from the side, his gaze unreadable. As the evening drew to a close, I said my goodbyes and promised to come back soon. But Caleb stopped me just before I left. "Evan seems to like you," he said, his voice softer than before. "That's good to hear," I replied. "I'll let you know," Caleb said, his eyes narrowing slightly as though he were calculating something in his mind. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work, school, and babysitting for Caleb. Every shift was a mix of ease and tension. of moments where I felt at home in the Whitman house, and others when I questioned whether I belonged there at all. Caleb was always polite, but distant. The few moments we had shared, those short conversations after Evan had gone to bed, seemed like fleeting connections. But then came that evening. The kind of evening that rewrote everything. I had been there for a couple of hours when Caleb returned from a late meeting. Evan was with me, his energy bubbling over as we played a board game at the dining table. I stood up to help Evan with a piece, and then I heard the sound of the door opening. "Caleb, you're home early," I said, not expecting him to arrive until much later. He looked tired, his face slightly flushed, his hair a bit disheveled as though he had rushed out of a meeting. But when his eyes met mine, there was a subtle shift in his expression, an intensity one hadn't noticed before. "Yeah, something came up," Caleb replied, his voice low, his gaze lingering on me a little too long. Evan's loud laughter broke the silence, and Caleb's face softened, his gaze moving to his son. But there was something in the way he watched us that made me pause. A quiet longing. Later that evening, as we all sat in the living room, Caleb joined us for a rare moment of family time. He wasn't usually so present, but something about the day had made him linger. We worked together on a puzzle, laughing over mistakes and pretending to argue over who got to place the final piece. It wasn't until Evan had gone to bed that the room fell silent. Caleb sat down next to me on the couch, the air between us crackling with an unspoken tension. "You know, you're really good with him," Caleb said, his voice quiet. "I wasn't sure at first. I'm not great at trusting people with Evan." I could hear the weight of his words, the vulnerability in them, but I wasn't sure how to respond. "You're just as good as he is," I said softly, glancing over at him. He studied me for a long time, his eyes lingering on my face. For a moment, it felt as though the entire world around us had gone still. But then, as if remembering himself, Caleb cleared his throat and stood up. "Thanks, Noah. I'll see you tomorrow." But I could still feel his eyes on me as I left the room, the space between us stretching with something unspoken, something that neither of us was ready to confront just yet. The days that followed were a blur of routine and uncertainty. I showed up to the Whitman house on the same schedule, but something had changed. Caleb's presence lingered in the air even when he wasn't there. It was subtle at first, a glance that held a fraction too long, a gesture that seemed more intentional than before, but it was enough to leave me questioning what was going on beneath the surface. The evenings after Evan went to bed were the hardest. Caleb would retreat to his office or the kitchen, always a few steps out of reach. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when we found ourselves alone. In those moments, I caught glimpses of a side of Caleb that wasn't the strict businessman I'd met that first day. There was something more there, something guarded and raw. One such evening, I had just finished tucking Evan into bed, humming a quiet lullaby as he drifted off. When I walked back down the stairs, I saw Caleb standing near the large glass doors that led to the balcony. The evening sun had long since set, but the sky outside was still tinged with shades of purple and orange. I paused in the doorway, not wanting to intrude, but Caleb noticed me immediately. He turned, his eyes meeting mine, the faintest hint of a smile curling his lips. "Evan's asleep?" he asked, his voice unusually soft. "Yeah, he's out cold. The dragon puzzle did the trick," I answered, trying to sound lighthearted. But there was a weight in my chest that I couldn't shake. Caleb stepped toward me, his movements deliberate. "Good. I wanted to ask you something." I tilted my head, curious. "What's up?" He hesitated for a moment, his gaze drifting to the floor. "You've been here for a while now, and I appreciate it, Noah. More than I think I've let on." I wasn't sure how to respond. It was the kind of statement that felt like an opening, like he was inching toward something, but I didn't know what. "It's not a problem at all," I said, my voice steady. "I love working with Evan. He's an amazing kid." Caleb's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, he seemed almost vulnerable, something I hadn't seen before. "No, I mean, I appreciate you. You've been more than just a babysitter. You've..." become a part of our lives in a way I didn't expect. There was something in his tone, an intensity that I hadn't heard before. I felt a tightening in my chest, a mix of excitement and fear. He was saying something. But what? Caleb, I began, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. I had no idea what he was getting at, but my pulse quickened as I realized that whatever it was important. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I didn't intend to make this awkward, but I think we need to talk. About boundaries. About things that have been unsaid. I swallowed, the words hanging in the air between us, heavy with meaning. What do you mean? He looked at me, his eyes filled with a quiet storm of emotions that I couldn't fully understand. But there was something magnetic in the way he stared at me, something that made it impossible to look away. I've been trying to keep things professional, Noah, but I've realized it's not that simple. My heart skipped a beat, a rush of heat flooding my face. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of us standing there, the space between us charged with an energy that felt undeniable. I don't want to make this uncomfortable for you, Caleb continued, his voice almost a whisper now, but I can't ignore it anymore. There's something between us, something I can't just pretend isn't there. I was silent for a long moment, unsure of what to say. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, and I could feel the weight of Caleb's words pressing down on me. He was admitting something that I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. I started, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to pull away, to maintain the boundaries that we had set from the beginning. But another part of me wanted to reach out to him, to see where this connection might lead, to explore whatever this was between us. Caleb stepped closer, and my breath caught in my throat. He reached out, his hand brushing against my arm. The touch was tentative, like he wasn't sure if I would pull away. But I didn't. I didn't pull away. I'm not asking for anything, Caleb said softly, his voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I needed to say it, to get it out in the open. I nodded slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. His words hung in the air between us like a confession, but there was something else there too. Something that made me want to believe him, to believe in what he was saying. You don't have to say anything, Caleb added, his eyes searching mine. But I want you to know that I'm not trying to make this difficult. I just needed to be honest with you. I wasn't sure what I felt in that moment. There was a part of me that wanted to say something, to acknowledge the feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface. But I stayed silent, unsure of how to process everything that had just happened. Caleb took a step back, and the space between us felt empty now. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable, he murmured, his voice low. I didn't mean to. I needed to be honest. Before I could respond, he turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving me standing there, my mind racing with questions. What had just happened? What did it mean? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same between us again. The next few days were strangely quiet. Caleb was still the same, focused, reserved, yet there was an undercurrent to his actions, a subtle shift in the way he interacted with me. We both avoided the topic of that conversation, but the air between us felt charged. I could feel the weight of it every time our eyes met, every time he smiled just a little too long. It was only when Evan had to stay with his grandmother for the weekend that things finally came to a head. Caleb invited me to stay for dinner, and though the invitation seemed casual, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening beneath the surface. We ate in the dining room, the table lit by a single candle in the center, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost intimate, but still laced with the tension of unspoken words. After the meal, Caleb offered me a drink. I accepted, and we sat down together in the living room, the space between us both comfortable and fraught with the weight of everything that had passed between us. Caleb finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than usual. "You're probably wondering why I brought you here tonight." I looked at him, trying to read his expression. "Honestly, I'm not sure." He chuckled softly, but it was a nervous sound, not one I'd heard from him before. "I'm not great at this, at opening up, but I want you to know that I respect you. I respect what you're doing here." I nodded, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "I appreciate that, Caleb." He took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "But I also want to be clear. I don't expect anything from you. Not anything that you don't want. I needed you to know how I feel. Because I can't keep pretending." The room seemed to shrink, the space between us charged with emotion. I could feel it, his words, his intentions, and the subtle pull between us. But there was no easy way to respond. I wasn't sure where this was going, but in that moment, I knew I couldn't turn away. We had crossed a line, and I didn't know how far it would take us. But for the first time in a long while, I felt something real stir within me, something I couldn't ignore. The following week passed in a quiet haze. Caleb's house, once a place of routine and predictable interactions, had transformed into a landscape of unspoken emotions, every glance between us heavy with meaning. I couldn't help but replay the conversations we'd had, the moments of silence that now seemed laden with something deeper. I was walking a fine line, caught between the comfort of familiarity and the pull of something new and unsettling. That Friday, after Evan had been dropped off at his grandmother's for the weekend, Caleb texted me asking if I could stay the night again to help with some tasks. It seemed like a harmless request, an extension of our regular arrangement, but the tone of his message felt different. There was a certain weight to it, a quiet urgency that I couldn't ignore. My heart thudded in my chest as I responded with a simple "sure, I'll be there around 6. I tried to push the unease aside as I made my way to the Whitman house. The evening was cooler than usual, and the air felt thick with anticipation. I arrived on time, to find Caleb already waiting for me at the door. His usual composed expression was replaced by something more complicated. Tired, perhaps, but with a flicker of something else that was harder to place. "Hey, Noah," Caleb greeted me, his voice softer than usual. He stepped aside to let me in, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. "Hey," I replied, stepping inside and instantly feeling the shift in the air. "Everything okay?" Caleb nodded, but didn't immediately answer. Instead, he led me into the living room, where a bottle of wine and 2 glasses sat on the coffee table. The room was lit by the soft glow of a few strategically placed lamps, casting a warm, intimate light across the space. "I thought we could relax a bit," Caleb said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. He poured the wine, his hands steady, but there was a slight tremor in his movements, something that told me this evening wasn't going to be like any of our previous encounters. I sat down, taking a deep breath as I tried to steady my own racing pulse. "Sounds good," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral, but I could feel the tension between us, thick and unyielding. He handed me a glass and then sat beside me, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, "about what we talked about last time. And I just want you to know that I'm not looking for any kind of pressure. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything." I nodded, but the words caught in my throat. "You don't have to apologize," I said. It's complicated. I'm not sure what I feel, Caleb. I don't know how to process all of this." Caleb sighed, setting his glass down on the table and leaning back. "Yeah, I get it. This isn't easy. I know I've probably made you uncomfortable. That's the last thing I want to do." I watched him carefully, noticing the vulnerability in his posture, the slight tension in his jaw. He was trying to stay composed, but there was something raw about him that I hadn't seen before. It made my chest tighten, a knot forming in my stomach as I realized how deeply conflicted he was. "Why don't we take this slow?" I suggested, my voice quieter than I intended. "I mean, we don't have to have everything figured out right now." Caleb's eyes softened at my words, his gaze shifting to the floor for a moment, as if he was trying to gather himself. When he looked back up at me, there was a flicker of something between us, something I wasn't sure how to label, but it was there, undeniable and electric. "I want to take it slow," he murmured, "but I also don't want to keep pretending like this doesn't matter. Like what's between us is just nothing." There it was again, the unspoken truth hanging between us, undeniable but still unacknowledged. My mind raced, trying to process the weight of his words. Was he saying he felt the same pull I did? That this thing, whatever it was, had grown beyond the boundaries we'd set? The silence stretched on for a moment, both of us uncertain of where to go next. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the fluttering in my chest. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," I repeated, this time more firmly, "but we can talk and see where it goes." Caleb nodded, his lips curling into a small, almost relieved smile. He reached for his glass again, taking a slow sip, and I did the same. The quiet between us was no longer awkward but comfortable, like we had both finally acknowledged something neither of us had been ready to confront. As the evening wore on, we talked, really talked, for the first time. The conversation was deep, introspective, and personal. We shared stories from our past, the things that shaped us, the fears we'd carried for years. Caleb spoke about his childhood, about growing up in a conservative family and the pressure of always having to be perfect, to fit into a mold that never quite suited him. I spoke about my own struggles, my hesitation to step into the world as who I truly was, the constant fear of rejection. The more we talked, the more I realized how much we had in common, how much we were alike, despite the different paths we'd taken in life. The evening grew late, and the conversation turned softer, more intimate, but without any sense of urgency. It felt like we were building something together, brick by brick, without the need for immediate answers. Caleb, more relaxed now, leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is complicated, but I also know that I don't want to ignore it anymore. I don't want to keep pretending like there's nothing between us." I felt my breath catch at his words, the weight of them settling on my chest. It was a confession, not just of feelings, but of something deeper. An acknowledgement that this wasn't just a passing moment, but something that had the potential to grow into something far more meaningful. I swallowed, my throat dry. "What do we do now?" I asked, unsure of what the next step was, but also strangely certain that there was no turning back from here. Caleb's hand brushed against mine, his touch gentle but deliberate. "We take it one step at a time," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "But we don't have to do it alone." There was a warmth in his words, in the simple gesture of his hand resting beside mine, that made me believe in the possibility of something more, something real. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where Caleb and I weren't just employer and employee, but something more. A future where we could explore the complexities of our feelings without fear or shame. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet moments shared between us. Caleb and I moved cautiously, as if walking on fragile ground. The boundaries we had once carefully crafted were slowly dissolving, replaced by something far more intimate. Yet, we never rushed. There was a careful tenderness to everything we did. The way we touched, the way our conversations deepened, the way our glances lingered a little longer than before. We found ourselves together more often. Whether it was working late on projects around the house or sitting together in the evenings, our connection grew. And with it came a new understanding of the emotions we both held, emotions that couldn't be ignored any longer. One evening, as we sat on the couch after dinner, Caleb leaned over, his lips brushing against my ear. It was an innocent gesture, or so I thought at first, but when he pulled away, there was a glimmer in his eyes that sent a jolt through my body. His fingers lingered on my shoulder, his touch sending sparks across my skin. "You're not afraid of this, are you?" he whispered, his voice soft, almost teasing. I turned to look at him, my heart racing. The question was simple, but the implications were anything but. The air between us had shifted again, and this time, the tension felt more palpable, more undeniable. "I'm not afraid," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know where it'll take us." Caleb smiled, his eyes never leaving mine. "Neither do I. But maybe that's the best part." I felt his hand on my cheek then, his fingers gently brushing my skin as he leaned in. The distance between us closed, and for the first time in weeks, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. His lips met mine, soft at first, testing the waters. The kiss was gentle, explorative, as if we were both trying to understand the emotions that had been building between us. The world outside the house faded away, leaving only Caleb and me, two people who had crossed a line and weren't looking back. Deepened slowly, hesitantly, like we were both trying to measure the distance between us, both emotionally and physically. Caleb's lips were soft against mine, and I could feel the warmth of his breath, the subtle tremor of his hand on my cheek. It was as though we were both afraid to move too quickly, afraid of what might happen if we pushed past this fragile moment. But as the seconds stretched on, I felt my own reservations begin to melt away. There was something undeniably comforting about the way Caleb held me, something safe about being in his presence despite the storm of emotions brewing inside me. I had spent so many years trying to protect myself from the possibility of getting hurt, from the fear of losing control. But right then, with Caleb's kiss tasting like an unspoken promise, I wasn't sure if I cared anymore. When he pulled back, there was a look in his eyes, intensity, vulnerability, longing, that told me this was no longer just about a fleeting connection. There was weight to it now, a sense of significance that neither of us had anticipated. His breath was shallow, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I didn't mean to push you," Caleb finally whispered, his voice unsteady. I shook my head, taking a deep breath. "You didn't push me, Caleb. I want this. I want to be here with you." The words hung between us, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. It was as if I had stepped into a new world, one where the rules were different, where the boundaries I'd built around myself no longer held. Caleb's hand found mine, and he squeezed it gently. His thumb brushed over my knuckles as if reassuring me, but there was something more in the way he held me, a quiet understanding, a shared recognition that this moment marked something pivotal in both of our lives. "I don't want to rush anything," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I also don't want to hold back anymore." I nodded in agreement, my heart racing as I tried to process the enormity of what he was saying. We were at a crossroads now, and there was no turning back. But in that moment, despite the uncertainty, there was a sense of peace. It wasn't fear that I felt, but anticipation. Of something new, something uncharted, but something that felt right. "I don't think we need to rush," I replied, my voice more confident than I felt. "But I do think we need to be honest with ourselves about what's happening. We can't pretend this isn't real." Caleb's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the weight of his own thoughts reflected in his eyes. The facade of control he always wore had slipped, leaving him raw and exposed. In that vulnerability, I saw a depth to him I hadn't fully realized before. The man I had worked for, respected, and admired was not just someone I had to be careful around. He was someone who, in this moment, needed me as much as I needed him. The silence between us was comfortable now, no longer filled with uncertainty. Caleb shifted, leaning in again. But this time, there was no hesitation in the way he kissed me. It was deep and slow, a slow-burning intimacy that set every nerve on edge. His hand found the back of my neck, pulling me closer as if he wanted to consume me, but also keep me close, anchored in the reality of this fragile connection. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, the rhythm of it echoing in my chest, syncing with my own pulse. The world outside seemed so far away now, irrelevant, like nothing else mattered except the way we fit together, the way our bodies responded to each other in perfect unison. And yet, even as our kiss deepened, I knew there was more we needed to explore. We hadn't yet crossed into the territory of physical intimacy, but the air between us crackled with the tension of what was to come. It wasn't just about the kiss or the closeness. It was about the vulnerability we were both allowing ourselves to show, the courage it took to let go of the defenses we had both so carefully constructed. Eventually, Caleb pulled back slightly, his breath coming in uneven gasps. "Noah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Are you sure?" The question hung in the air like a delicate thread, and I could hear the uncertainty in his tone. But there was also a sense of respect in it, a recognition that this was my choice as much as it was his. It was as though he was asking if I was ready to let go, to step into the unknown with him. I closed my eyes for a moment, collecting my thoughts. I could feel my pulse racing, the weight of the decision pressing on my chest. This wasn't just about the physical act. It was about everything else. The emotions we had been dancing around for weeks, the tension that had been building ever since that first night we had spent together. And as I opened my eyes again, I knew I was ready. Ready to stop pretending. Ready to stop holding back. "I'm sure," I replied, my voice steady. "I want this, Caleb. I want us." With that, Caleb's expression softened, and he leaned in again, kissing me with a tenderness that was almost heartbreaking. This time, it wasn't just the kiss that took my breath away. It was everything that came with it. The emotions that I had been holding back for so long. The desire to be close to him in a way I had never allowed myself to be with anyone else. Slowly, Caleb shifted, guiding me to lie back on the couch as he hovered above me. The world outside seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of us in this shared space. I could feel his weight pressing down on me, the warmth of his body against mine, and my heart was racing as the gravity of what we were about to do sank in. But there was no fear in me now, no hesitation. I had already crossed that line when I kissed him back, when I admitted to myself that I wanted more than what we had been. We had already started something, and there was no stopping it now. Caleb's lips trailed down to my neck, his touch soft but insistent as he kissed me in a way that made my skin burn. His hands moved slowly, as if he was still unsure of how far to go. But I could feel the heat building between us with every touch, every caress. As he continued to kiss me, I allowed myself to relax into the moment, my body responding to his in ways I hadn't expected. The emotions swirling inside me were a mix of excitement, fear, and an overwhelming sense of connection. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive, fully present in the moment, and completely attuned to Caleb's every movement. He paused for a moment, his forehead resting against mine, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. But when he spoke, his voice was filled with conviction. "Are you sure?" he repeated, his hands still lingering at my sides. I nodded, my chest rising and falling with each breath. "I'm sure, Caleb. We don't have to rush. But we can't keep holding back either." A quiet tension passed between us, and then, without another word, Caleb kissed me again, more urgently this time. His hands moved with a purpose, exploring the contours of my body as he pressed closer to me. The heat between us intensified, and as we continued to explore each other, I knew this moment, this connection, was just the beginning. The intensity between us didn't fade, and even though we were both careful, neither of us could deny the magnetic pull that seemed to guide us further into uncharted territory. As Caleb's lips brushed against mine once more, the world beyond the room seemed distant, as if we were suspended in time. Each kiss was a quiet promise, each touch a silent confession of desires long held but never voiced. We were becoming something new, something more than the roles we had played in each other's lives until now. The boundaries of our pasts, once so clearly defined, were blurring, and in their place was a space we were both learning to inhabit together. We moved in sync, as though our bodies had always known how to dance with one another. Caleb's hands, though gentle, spoke a language of their own, coaxing my body into an embrace that felt both foreign and completely familiar. The tentative steps we had taken, the hesitation in our movements, began to dissolve. There was no more uncertainty, No more questioning whether we were ready. We were simply two souls drawn together by an invisible force, and nothing outside the moment seemed to matter. As the evening stretched on, time seemed to slip away, leaving behind only the quiet rhythm of our breathing, the soft rustle of sheets, and the quiet exchange of affection between us. When we finally pulled back, breathless and tangled in each other's embrace, there was no need for words. Our connection, so fragile at first, had become something undeniable, something we both knew was worth exploring, even if the future still held questions we couldn't yet answer. I rested my head against Caleb's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly present, truly seen. We had crossed a line, but what lay beyond that line was still a mystery. What would this mean for us, for our lives moving forward? Would we be able to navigate this new chapter, or would the weight of our emotions pull us apart as it often did in stories like ours? But as Caleb's arms tightened around me, holding me close, I realized that for now, all that mattered was the moment we had created together. Tomorrow would come with its own questions and challenges. But tonight, we had something real. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As I continued to care for Caleb's home, the familiar rhythm of my days remained unchanged, but something between us had shifted, something that no amount of time or distance could erase. The intimacy we had shared had not changed the essence of our relationship, but it had deepened it in ways I hadn't expected. There were no grand declarations, no promises made or expected, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. I wasn't just the babysitter anymore, and he wasn't just the employer. We had crossed a line, and now we navigated the spaces between us with a quiet respect and a shared sense of something more. We carried on, and though I couldn't predict what the future would hold, I knew that whatever it was, we would face it together. Perhaps that was the beauty of it, that, despite everything, we still had the courage to remain in each other's lives, uncertain of where it would lead, but knowing that this bond, fragile as it might be, was something worth preserving.